Okay, so we are live. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Faiz, for joining me today. I'm just going to give a little introduction. So Faiz Abhuani is a real estate agent and founder of Brick by Brick. They're an organization that builds social housing in Parc Extension. Sophie Hart is the founder of Meals for Milton Parc. They support unhoused people in the neighborhood of Milton Parc in the Plateau Montreal borough. And Chris Curtis is an investigative journalist for the Rover, an interactive reporting project run through Ricochet Media. Chris is often focusing on reporting that focuses on marginalized communities, including unhoused folks in Montreal and First Nations and Métis in Quebec. So yeah, there's been a lot to talk about considering homelessness and the housing crisis in Montreal. This past week, Raphael Andre, a homeless man from the Matamacouche-Lac-Jean Innu Nation, passed away. He was found frozen to death Sunday morning after spending the night in the cold in Milton Parc. Raphael Andre, we've seen him a little bit in the news, and Sophie, I want to direct this next question at you because the Meals for Milton Parc Instagram page, you guys have been talking about it a lot. And what has been the response from you guys and your opinion on this situation?
Yeah, so I think that Raphael dying was kind of the wake-up call a lot of people needed to acknowledge our worries we've had since summertime. We've been continually talking about how unhoused people will be affected by COVID and how the COVID outbreaks will affect the shelter system that was already not working before we had a pandemic. So unfortunately, it's really brought to light a lot of the issues that we've been trying to get acknowledged by the government for a long time, and the fact that someone had to die for this to happen is heartbreaking. I work at Royal Vic, the old Royal Vic, which is now a place for people to quarantine while they are COVID positive if they are housing insecure. And there was a lot of upset in the community. People were really heartbroken. For many of the people at my work, they weren't able to see him before he passed away because they had been quarantining for a few days. And it's just kind of the worst possible situation. It's probably the most awful way to die, in my opinion. It's just, there was a lack of just care for the people in our community after the open door had to close. I was in Toronto when it first closed down, and I was just like kind of just heartbroken because I knew that people were going to be in unsafe and precarious situations because the open door is a place for a lot of people to find some safety and some warmth throughout the winter, even before they were 24 hours. But the 24-hour aspect really adds another layer to safety for unhoused people in Milton Parc. So yeah, I think it was kind of a time that the community was able to come together over this extremely tragic situation and acknowledge the ongoing crisis we have in our community and with our unhoused neighbors, because the situation is just pretty dire most days, especially with the cold weather. And it's good that the government is finally like talking with us and acknowledging our concerns and demands, but the fact that someone had to die for the government to respond is kind of ludicrous.
Absolutely, thank you. Chris, you've reported on deaths of homeless lives, including 2 Inuit women that were hit by cars over this past summertime. Does the lockdown and curfew put homeless folks at greater risk of danger?
Absolutely. I think that to avoid being caught outside, if you're a woman, you might stay with an abusive partner. If you're in sex work, you'll put yourself in riskier situations just to get by. Sex workers might encounter clients that kind of know that they have more power now because if the person's outside, they're subject to a fine, they're subject to harassment, being pulled over, being kind of a shakedown from the police. So they know that they can try and pay less, they can try and get away with more, so you create there's this power imbalance that already exists, and you sort of kick it into overdrive. And then of course, you have people who are, nobody wants to pay a $1,500 ticket. And even if you can't afford to pay the ticket and you arrange for something else, you still owe $1,500 to the government, and they make you work it off with, like, you won't go to jail for not paying your fine, but you'll have to do community service hours, and until that fine is paid, it's actually a mark against your credit score. So if things are kind of coming together for you, if you need a credit check to get an apartment or to buy a car, or to do the sort of things that you would need to do to organize your life a little bit more, then that ticket kind of weighs you down like an albatross. So people will do a lot of things to avoid getting those tickets. And a lot of the things that they do, including, kind of hiding from the police or maybe going somewhere a little less safe, is absolutely dangerous.
Thank you, Chris. So I want to talk a little bit about the curfew. For any non-Quebecers tuning in, the curfew was put in place by the Quebec government aimed to decrease the rates of COVID in the province. The curfew will run until February 8th. It applies to all of Quebec except the Cree territory of James Bay and Nunavik. So this prohibits people from leaving their house, except for people who have dogs. They can walk them around 1 kilometer radius from their house. This includes me, but I do find it a little bit ridiculous that I can go outside. Meanwhile, homeless people, it's illegal for them to exist when they don't have a house. So yeah, people who are caught outside as a non-essential worker, not walking their dogs, they can receive a fine up to $6,000. So Chris, I was recently reading one of your articles, and you mentioned that a homeless Montrealer was given a fine of $1,500 for being outside after curfew. Have you come into contact with any other homeless people recently who've received fines?
Well, yeah, a former colleague of ours actually, Michelle Pucci, who used to be the editor-in-chief of The Link and was a journalist at CBC. She was at Resilience Montreal the other day. She's in law school, and so a lot of McGill law students are working on this, trying to make sure that if somebody did get a ticket, that they can get their hands on that ticket or the information, and they can help this person contest the ticket. So my understanding is there have been at least 6 or 7 incidences where someone was given a ticket for being outside and they're homeless. I only met the one person, and obviously his name's Mike. They call him Mike, and he's Indigenous, and I think of the 6 people who've had tickets, at least 2 of them are Indigenous. So like, it's disproportionately affecting the most marginalized people already. There was just a study released today by HAPSIM, which is an advocacy group, but they studied 4 years of police data, and the Quebec Premier François Legault said police aren't having fun giving these tickets out, but nobody's accusing the police of having fun doing this, but the reality is that in the last, in the 4 years of data they studied, from 2014 to 2018, police handed out 50,000 tickets to the homeless. It depends on what your definition is of homeless, if it counts the occasional homeless, if it counts people who are couch surfing, that kind of thing. But, between 3,000 and 5,000 people in this city live on the streets, and they got 50,000 tickets for loitering, for drinking, in a 4-year period. So this is already a huge problem, And again, the problem is you put them into this system where they have to pay this off and they have this debt and that lingers over them, and it makes their lives a lot worse. It's very stressful. The police, it gives the police another reason to stop you and talk to you. If you have a drug problem already, maybe you're carrying heroin on you, maybe you're carrying some kind of a drug, and it's not because you're a bad person, you're just, that's the addiction that you're dealing with. And so it's just one more big problem on a series of problems that kind of keep people in this cycle of, you're always in the system. Your name's always on a computer somewhere. There's always some sort of, you always have to get out from under something. So you talk about, wanting people to be safe and wanting people to get their, to become, productive members of society again. It's very difficult to do that when you're always in the judicial system. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing.
Thank you, Chris. So Valerie Plante said the curfew has added unnecessary stress to homeless shelters in the city, asking for homeless folks to be exempt from the curfew. In response, Premier Francois Legault said, right now the police are doing a very good job. They're using their judgment, and if we change the rule and say you cannot give tickets to somebody who says they're homeless, you may have some people who pretend to be homeless. Sophie, could you let me know what you think of that response?
Yeah, I just think it's so ridiculous and out of touch. In terms of what Chris was saying as well, there isn't a good rapport between the police service and unhoused people already. From my work at Milton Parc, there's always police present at Milton Parc harassing unhoused people, and to put it like bluntly, the unhoused people don't trust the police system, and especially Indigenous unhoused people don't trust the police system in Montreal. There's no level of community or reciprocity between those two communities in our neighborhood. So it's just unreliable. They're unreliable, and it's unrealistic to expect unhoused people to trust a system that's continually putting them in unsafe situations and applying too much force. I know even at Royal Vic, where I work, we still have issues of the police trying to get involved in situations where we have multiple intervention workers on the ground with the people who are using the services. So I honestly can't imagine what it's like for unhoused people when they are dealing with the police one-on-one. And the Montreal Police Service is known for continually targeting, harassing, and ticketing Indigenous unhoused people. So in terms of Milton Parc as well, most of our unhoused population is Inuit. And we know that from their culture, there's no police. They don't believe in that level of separation between citizens. And it's just continuing the system, as Chris said, of people being stuck in this homelessness cycle, which involves the justice system and involves the housing insecurity. People are just being bounced around between shelters, the street, and jails, which, it's heartbreaking to know that there's no level of support coming from the Montreal government themselves. There aren't any intervention workers that work specifically for Montreal to work with the unhoused population. I know I've only been working with the unhoused population for 5 months now, and I feel like every time I find out more about Montreal's stance on how to support the unhoused people, I'm just more shocked, because there just really is this level of not treating people with dignity and treating people like they're kind of a menace that don't need support the same way the rest of the citizens do. So yeah, I was reading about how the federal Indigenous Affairs member of Parliament was critiquing Legault and what he said about the curfew affecting unhoused people, because we know there's a large population of unhoused people who are Indigenous in Montreal.
At least 10%, and they're less than 1% of the population. So it's a gigantic overrepresentation.
Mm-hmm. So to not acknowledge that as well is ridiculous in my opinion, because there needs to be special care to the population.
If I can interject with one thing, I'll play the role of the jerk who like, I think there are a lot of police officers who want to do the right thing. There's the group called Emery, which I'm sure you know. They work with the homeless and they get the homeless to certain services, but it's a tiny group. And the police force is something like 4,000 police officers, and there are only maybe 8 or 9 people who do that. There is an Indigenous liaison officer, and there have been efforts, but the problem is that it's as you said again and again, it's systemic, right? It's that they're trained to see everything as a problem, where the end of the solution is always, or the sort of trump card that they always have is handcuffs, back of the car, and that's one problem. And then the other thing is about the city is that they're so reliant on the province because people who are unhoused, this is a public health issue, right? And all of the funding comes from Canada and Quebec. So the city actually doesn't have much independent power in this. And we have a provincial government which only has 2 members of the Legislative Assembly who are on the island of Montreal, and they're way in the suburbs. So there are no elected officials on the ground in downtown Montreal, where this is the biggest part of the problem, although it extends into many other areas, including remote cities like Val d'Or. But the problem is, the city doesn't have enough independence when it comes to spending this kind of money. We have to kind of go hat in hand to the federal government for Indigenous resources and to the provincial government for healthcare resources. And it's clear that this just isn't a priority of this government, and that's extremely unfortunate. I'm sorry, I'll stop saying things.
No, yeah, I totally agree. It's just, yeah, that's also part of the issue, is that there's no clear way to solve this. There's no kind of way. If we want to make things better, it's going to take basically all levels of government, and it's going to take a commitment for multiple years to work towards a better future for the unhoused people in Montreal. It also is the issue of unhoused people not being included in what decisions are made. They have no autonomy over what's happening, what services are being created. So yeah, it's just ridiculous between the ways each level of government will blame and critique each other. But with that blame and critique, it doesn't really matter if the people who are the most vulnerable are still being affected day after day.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you bring that up about the different governments, because in my video, one of the things I spoke about with Sam Watts, actually this got cut from the video because there was so much that was kind of hard to keep in, but Sam Watts, the CEO of Welcome Home Mission,
yeah.
Exactly, he was saying that our municipal government has a plan, the provincial government has a plan, and so does the federal government, but none of these plans link up. So it's like if we all get on one page, then maybe concrete action can actually be made. But if we're all kind of doing these different plans, then it doesn't really seem like it's going to work.
I just have one more thing to add to that.
Mm-hmm.
We're constantly responding to each crisis as well. So it's so hard almost for community organizations to make grand, huge plans for the future when we have to respond to each awful thing that's happening. It seems like week after week there's a new crisis coming on, which kind of takes our planning process away from the work and the time we need to put towards the future. So that's why we need the government to be able to work together on that, because the community organizations are so swamped with what's going on. And we
Because
don't
you're constantly trying to stop the bleeding, and you don't have time to proactively work towards other plans because you just can't. Yeah.
So it's hard.
You do great work. You do great work.
Thank you.
There needs to be more of you, but you do great work.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, when I was putting this video together, one of the biggest challenges I found was just trying to do the topic justice, because I'm sure, as you feel when you're doing reporting on this topic, Chris, you know, there's so much information out there, but to really keep people engaged, you kind of have to keep the main parts. And one of the things that I you know, really felt at a loss not putting in was kind of exploring sexual violence and how the unhoused people, they can be put at greater risk because of this. So Chris, I want to ask you, would you say that homeless folks are at greater risk of sexual violence?
Oh, 100%. It's alarming. You work a little bit with the Open Door. Back when they were on Atwater, it was this is the numbers here I'm going to pull out are approximate, but there were 20 women who had come forward to make a complaint that they'd been sexually assaulted, brutally sexually assaulted, and only of the 20 complaints that went to the police, and there are many, many, many more that didn't go to the police, but of the 20 that went to the police, I think there was only a follow-up on 2. There were only criminal charges on 2 of these, and I don't even know what happened after that. You lose track of it because people give up on the process, because the process is difficult for any survivor of sexual violence. Never mind if you're Indigenous, which all of these 20 women were. All these 20 women were Indigenous. Never mind if you're Indigenous, and never mind if you're also living on the street, and never mind if you also happen to be a sex worker. So you have like all these different layers of kind of people maybe not believing you or not trusting your judgment or judging you for what happened to you. So it is, sexual violence is one of the most prevalent and probably underreported phenomena for people who live on the streets, men and women. When the Open Door finally moved to Parc Avenue, I remember a case where this woman had her life threatened, and the police picked the guy up and they just drove him around the corner and dropped him off. And to his great credit, the current Indigenous Services Minister, he wasn't at the time, I don't think, Mark Miller, heard of the story, called me up and told me he was going to visit. He's not his jurisdiction, but he was going to visit the police station and let them know exactly how wrong that was. And the man did end up getting arrested, but imagine being the victim imagine surviving this person's attack, and then that you're the predator was released a few blocks away, so you live in fear for your life. You hide out, and I'd spoken to this woman, and she still lives with this. It's something you carry. So often when you see someone and maybe they're intoxicated or maybe they're not like super stable, or maybe you kind of have to remind yourself that their trauma is very real and very fresh, and it plays itself out a lot, and a lot of the people who kind of take advantage of that, who often themselves were the victim of sexual violence or violence, are generally kind of also roaming the streets, and there isn't really accountability, and there isn't a lot of psychosocial support for these survivors. So it is, Savanna, it is a terrifying reality of life on the street, and it's, it's something that it keeps you up at night.
Thank you for sharing, Chris. So the Meals for Milton Parc Instagram recently shared a few slides of Valerie Plant's Instagram story, where it showcased new emergency shelters for homeless people in the city. And Sophie, the Instagram, well-deservingly critiqued the new emergency shelters, comparing them to dog kennels. Could you tell us a little bit about why you think these shelters are inadequate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's such a hard thing to kind of grasp, where you have to recognize that emergency shelters are a necessity and they have to be existing, and we need them for people who are living on the streets. But it's hard when the government is creating these emergency shelters and not creating long-term solutions as well, because these emergency shelters are the type of thing that keep people in the streets. People don't want to go to these shelters. People aren't given places to live where they have things to keep them entertained. There's no level of enjoyment. If you can see the pictures, it's literally like a box with 3 walls. There's not even a 4th wall. There's no privacy. There's no dignity for these adults who are fully autonomous beings. So it's just Valerie Plante's response to be like, oh, but we're building 100 beds, isn't really fixing the issue of us having thousands of people who are living housing insecure in Montreal. And without long-term action to say that we're building these affordable places, or we're working towards bringing in social workers to talk to people to see if people are interested in finding housing first solutions, it doesn't really mean much to me. And I think there's an issue as well with organizations that people are running at full steam at all times, trying to make sure people don't die and people aren't on the streets sleeping overnight. But at the same time, there has to be a certain level of care given to these people, because these people are vulnerable and many of them have issues with mental illness and addiction and violence and trauma that they're also dealing with, which also keep them in a state of living that they're currently living in. So it's just not enough for me for her to say we've created 100 beds with no privacy in a soccer stadium. We're done, like game over. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that we need those beds, but it's important to also critique how far those beds are away from most of the population, which is downtown. And many people who are living on the streets don't have, unless there's a shuttle bus service that's picking up everyone and making sure everyone's on that bus, there's no accountability that those people will have a place to go that night. There's continually lines and like hour-long waits outside the hotel shelters downtown, and it's just, the system is just not working, which is the issue at the center of all of this. But yeah, I don't think, while I recognize these emergency shelters are really important and keep people alive, it isn't really a standard of living that anyone else would agree to if they weren't in a desperate situation to keep themselves safe overnight.
Absolutely. Thank you. So in the first episode, I spoke to Amy Darwish. She's a part of the Parc Extension Action Committee, and she discussed that gentrification is rapidly happening in Parc X as a result of the new expansion of the UDM campus. Faiz, I'm sorry to keep you on the back burner. We had to build up to social housing a little bit, but thank you for your patience.
No problem.
And I just wanted to ask, could you explain a little bit about how gentrification contributes to the homeless population and ultimately just pushes people out on the streets?
Yeah, that's a huge question. But I think taking off from what Sophie and Chris were saying, I think that in many different instances, they in my mind, they're showing that the problem is really systemic. For example, in the city of Montreal, 4 times more money is spent on policing than on housing. And as we can see, the police don't really serve everyone equally. And we were talking about that earlier when we were talking about how the response to COVID, the response to crises, um, doesn't affect everyone equally. The response from the authorities is often centered on meeting the needs of one class uh, of voters, I guess, uh, and not so much another class of voters. In the city of Montreal, the the budgeting and the response is really geared towards homeowners because they're the ones who pay the municipal taxes. Uh, a lot of the decisions around zoning are also determined in that same way. So there's a huge lack of housing in general, not just for low-income people. And part of that is caused by very restrictive zoning in the central districts. And the reason for that is that over the last 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, there's this process that Amy mentions is being called gentrification, has been kind of taking over real estate in Montreal and in major cities in North America. And that means that there's a new class of people that are coming back to the city after leaving in the middle of the century after the Second World War. And they want basically the conveniences of the city and the security, quote unquote, security and quality of life of the suburbs. So they don't want more buildings, especially not buildings that are going to house, uh, uh, you know, people that are deemed undesirable. I don't think that these decisions are made like consciously in that way. I think a lot of different, like when I go to the zoning office and I say I want to build a housing project here, and I want to make, for it to be viable, I want to make 40 units. They're going to say, oh, you're not allowed to build more than 3 floors here, and you can only build on 50% of the lot because we want to have more green space so that people can breathe more and children can play and it's just more pleasant for everyone. And it's hard to argue against that because everybody needs green space and public space and all that kind of stuff. Um, but at the same time, we're in a housing crisis and we need housing for people. So it's really a question of values and a question of like who makes decisions on whose behalf. Um, so to get back to Parc Extension and to your question, yes, specifically in our neighborhood, what we've observed is that the price of real estate has gone up significantly, following an increase in the in the prices of rents, and the price of rent is increasing based on that manufactured sort of scarcity that's based on the values of not building too much and the city is too cramped already and we want more green space and we want like a nice environment on the one hand, and on the other hand by increased demand from students and professionals who are kind of looking to live around the new university campus and the Milex area, which is being subsidized as a tech hub for tech companies, gaming companies. We have Microsoft building a huge AI complex there. Uh, so that increased demand, along with forced scarcity, is driving up the prices and making it impossible to build housing. Now, just very quickly on social housing, uh, as it is, the budgets in the city, the city is now, for the first time after a very long time, responsible for managing the social housing program. So I'm going to say the city, but it's true, Chris, that it's the provincial government's responsibility. Um, but yeah, so the city is the city's budget, or the Axélogie budget for social housing, is extremely low, and it's the same amount of money pretty much no matter where you build in Quebec. Obviously, in Montreal, the price of land is extremely high, so the central districts are not really seeing any social housing being built in the past couple of decades, except when the city intervenes and subsidizes a project by buying up a property at market and selling it to a nonprofit developer like Brick by Brick at a loss. And that is dependent on the city's budget, which I've already mentioned is extremely low. So there is a budgetary constraint. There's a constraint that comes from the market, from the increased demand, and from values. And that, when I talk about the city, there's two aspects of the city. Zoning is determined by bureaucrats that are not elected, and then the budgets are determined by politicians who are elected. So there's a lot of work to be done. But in addition to all this, I just want to mention that the city's budget, I mean, in terms of in terms of real estate, investments in real estate, 5% of all investment in real estate is public. 95% is private. So even if the city was to double its budget, which is completely unthinkable, it would still be only 10% of the market. So a lot of the responsibility of what's happening here actually rests in the decisions that ordinary people make when they decide to rent, buy, and sell property. And so as tenants, I think it's really important for people to think long-term and transfer their leases, to fight their landlords on rent increases, to help each other out in finding housing, number one. Super important for people who buy to consider, well, maybe not buying, but then they're also renting. So thinking about what they're going to do with their privilege and with their social capital and all that. And people who sell to, instead of maybe pocketing the appreciation on their property, to reinvest in their community. So one thing I really recommend my clients to do, and I'm setting up partnerships with different organizations, is to invest in our project to build social housing in the Native Women's Shelter, Resilience Montreal, and other Indigenous solidarity groups, so that the resources can flow back around. But obviously, that's not really a systemic answer to the problem. But I just wanted to mention that it's not just the government that's the problem. It's also everybody's actions that's the problem.
Is there any cities that you can think of that you would say have successfully provided proper affordable housing and successfully reduced homelessness? And if it's okay, would you be fine to just enunciate a little bit more? Some of our viewers are having a bit of a hard time hearing you.
Oh, sorry. I went on and on. People didn't hear me. Jesus. Okay. Yes, there are examples of cities that have quote unquote socialized housing. One notable example, which is a city-state, is Singapore. I think something like 90% of all housing in Singapore is state-owned, and so they don't really. I mean, I don't know. I'm not from there. This is kind of like what the hearsay is in the real estate world, but they don't really have homelessness because they make sure that there's a wide range of prices for everyone, and that there's, I think in many countries you still have very strict rental control. Probably in terms of policy, the cheapest way for the city to secure housing, or actually it's a provincial thing, is to reinforce rather than loosen tenant rights, tenants' rights, like just legislation. Because right now they're loosened it. Like just recently they passed a law that says that the landlord has to has the right to deny a sublet the same way that it can deny a lease transfer. So that's before that wasn't the case. Before, if you could sublet, and you would be responsible as the tenant. So there's little things that are happening now that they're eating away. There's a law called the Bill 16 or something provincially that's eating away tenants' rights. But tenants' rights is one thing. There's also getting tenants to be informed and to be confident to fight for their rights. Because in Parc Extension, one of the problems we have is people don't really speak French or English, and they don't have that confidence. They're racialized people, so they don't fight, and they may not know that they have rights. They're afraid of going against their landlords. So the owners get away with murder here. And
Can I ask?
Sorry.
Can I ask? I've heard the suggestion of creating a rent registry, like where everybody knows what everyone's paying. You don't just have to take the landlord's word for it. There really is. It's really enforced.
That's the thing is that's important and it's helpful, but it's really something that's helpful for people who are literate and people who are educated. People who are not. In fact, the law is already there. If you have a lease and the previous rent is not there, you have 10 days to contest it, and you can take it to the regie, and they'll bring it back to the previous lease.
Mhm.
And it's the onus of proof is on the landlord. Nobody knows that. So I mean, even just defending the rights that already exist would be great, you know. So tenants' rights groups are super underfunded. They need to be they're funded actually by United Way and the peanuts, you know. So they need to be publicly funded. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, like legal
And
aid.
landlords, I
So
guess, are very aware of that power imbalance, and they kind of know how to throw their weight around and maybe make it sound like, oh, you know, I'll give you this one concession, so it's okay, don't worry, you don't have to go to the authorities.
yeah, I mean, I would say one thing about that is there's, you know, like when you were saying like there's good police and there's bad police, you know, it's like a laughable statement, but it's technically true. And it's also technically true that there are good landlords and there are bad
Yeah.
landlords. Also a laughable statement, also technically true. And so the thing about the good landlords, if I may, is that they're often not the long time owners, small time owners who maybe inherited from their parents and lived in the properties previously. They're often not the ones that are causing trouble. They sell, and there's a whole industry, like a booming industry
Like the
of
rent evictions.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like people who are buying property not to hold and to rent out and to make a few percentage every year, but really to quote unquote optimize. And there's workshops like just like really crooks
Yeah, I
teaching
covered some of that
people who
last
don't have a
year.
lot.
Not
Yeah,
Share
exactly.
Lab, the company like that tells you
And so
basically
what
how to get
happens
rid of
is
your tenants and double your profits and all that kind of stuff.
totally. And what happens is a lot of middle class people who want to get out of the rat race get into this business, quote unquote business, and they're buying at a loss, expecting that they're going to be able to turn over tenants. So when the tenants fight, it becomes extremely conflictual because your people's life savings are on the
Yeah.
line. So it's really a kind of tragic situation in many cases, but I'm not going to get into all that because we're talking about homelessness. But yeah,
Faiz, I'm going to need you to point me in the direction of these good landlords. I don't know what I mean.
hey, well, I mean, a lot of like social, like Brick by Brick's a good landlord, you know, like a lot of, but yeah, like non-social, like private, yeah, oh yeah, there's tons, there's tons.
Never met one. um, so yeah, I'm gonna pivot a little bit back to homelessness, but this also has to do with social aid. So for the first episode, I interviewed a man from the Notre Dame tent city, Alexandre, and he was explaining to me that you know, he's on social aid, but he has to be able to afford food, transit, a cell phone plan in order to seek employment. So after kind of all those expenses, he wasn't able to afford a place to live. Chris, is this a situation that you've seen in numerous homeless people in Montreal?
Oh God, I mean, what ends up happening is the list of places that you can conceivably afford for $800 a month or $600, most of your check is going there. If not all of your check is going to go there. So where do you get the rest of your money? You know, you panhandle, you go out on the street, you go to somewhere like the Open Door or somewhere like the you know, you go to a food bank. There are ways to survive, but to actually start building that, you know, that foundation that you need to have a sustainable life, working a job or whatever, is quite difficult. So, and then the other thing is when you end up having to rent really cheap places, given how expensive rent is these days, you might end up in like a slum. You might end up in a place that has bed bugs. You might end up in a place that you have to deal with a guy who owns 10 or 12 buildings, and you know, for whom this is just an investment project. They'll flip the building eventually, but in the meantime, they just have to kind of make their payments and collect from you, and they're not going to be giving you any services, or they might be late to get. But there are good landlords, but I think when you are in that situation where all you can afford is $600-700 a month, which, you know, in it used to be possible in Montreal, but increasingly it's not, and because of that scarcity, and so you are in a kind of, it puts you in a bind, and a lot of people will have an apartment in the summer, or sorry, in the winter, and then the summer comes around and it's like I want to have some spending money, I want to have a little bit more freedom, I'm tough as hell. I'll sleep outside, and I'll have all this cash on me, and I get that. So it again, it's one of those things that keeps you in that cycle of kind of just getting by, just surviving, and that's, imagine always being in survival mode. Like, we've all kind of had tough times, and we've probably all had to think on our feet. But for some of these people, it's like 24 hours a day you're thinking on your feet. And and if you have mental health problems, if you have an addiction, like, this is super triggering. So it's not easy. Absolutely.
From our conversation and the other interviews that I've had leading up to this story, a lot of what I gather is that, we need to reduce kind of Band-Aid solutions, such as, temporary shelters, things like that. And we need a lot more affordable housing in this city, rent increases to be halted, as well as things like rent evictions. I wanted to ask the three of you, if there's anything that we didn't kind of talk about, or if you'd want to elaborate a little bit more, what can be done to reduce the homeless population in Montreal, so that, we're not just putting forward these Band-Aid solutions. Sophie, if you'd like to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree, but I think it's also important to recognize how it has to be housing first solution. So people can come to these houses without having 3 references, and without having someone who knows them for 6 months who can use them, or can be like someone to put their trust in them. A lot of people need the house first so they can build on that. They need to have a place where they can call home, so they can organize to go towards having a therapist, having mental health services, addiction services. There needs to be a place where people can really just heal from living on the streets, because living on the streets for many is a very tough situation. Some people choose to do that, but a lot of people are in situations where that's their only option. So yeah, when we talk about affordable housing, I think it's also really important to acknowledge how it has to be a system that allows anyone to have housing, and that includes addicts, and that includes people who have been incarcerated. Everything along those lines, it has to be a solution that will include everyone. And in terms of accessibility as well, there has to be places for people who have physical ailments. And another thing on that as well is that people don't want to leave their communities. So people want to be with their people, and people that they call family. And that also has to be acknowledged as well, because people won't just move 30 minutes away if they're offered an apartment there. They'd rather stay with their community and the people that they get support from, which I think is really fair, because that's the only level of support they have. And to ask people to go 30 minutes away is just not going to happen, especially when these people have a lack of mobility often, and aren't comfortable always using the transit system on their own. And then I think it's also important to acknowledge, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's important to recognize how people, it's not going to be an overnight thing. Like, people are going to make mistakes when they go to the first housing units. It's not going to be like a flip of a switch. People are ready to live inside again, which is something that we're also experiencing at Royal Vic, is that this is the first time people have been kind of, well, it's a very unique situation because they are COVID positive, but it's the first time they've been in one room, in one bed for months. People don't have the consistency of having somewhere to go every night, having somewhere where they know they can get their needs met. So yeah, there's so many layers to it, which really creates a lot of areas to make mistakes. But I think the most important thing we could do is creating housing first services while also having people who are living on the streets have their say in it. Because if we're going to make housing first services that people don't want, we're just wasting our money and we're wasting tax dollars. So there has to be an inclusion of the people that the government wants to help in the decision-making process, or else the services won't get used.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Chris, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
How much time do we have? No. Look, I think in the last 25 years, we have come a long way. 25 years ago, nobody really knew what Housing First was. You go to a place like the old Brewery Mission, the majority of people who frequent that establishment are in some form of housing. It used to just be, a Band-Aid. You go there for the night, and then they kick you out in the morning. Same with something like Maisons du Bar. Chez Doris have a program through the federal government that has helped find housing for dozens of Inuit women in Quebec. So there are definitely programs that work. The problem is, it's the funding is inconsistent. If overnight we switch back to, say, a conservative federal government, well, the odds are they're going to do an austerity, have an austerity budget and cut back on those kinds of expenses. So the funding needs to be consistent, and the issue has to be housing first and access to mental health care, access to all that sort of stuff. It's not going to happen overnight. Huge problem that we need to address is the people having to leave a remote First Nation or a remote community because of a housing crisis over there. So often these people are kind of like refugees in their own country. Mm-hmm. They have to leave because maybe they live in a house with 10 other people and it's a tiny house, or maybe there's an abusive person in town or whatever. They have to come here, and they come here and they find that there are people who take advantage of how little they know the city. There are predators who see an Indigenous woman, for instance, as the sort of the perfect victim. No one's going to care about this person, and she doesn't know who to go to, and she doesn't trust the police. So a lot of it is obviously investing in housing first, but a lot of it is let's address those root causes of why people are leaving their territories. And I mean, obviously, and if they have to leave, or if they want to leave to come to Montreal for school or for healthcare or what have you, that we have a better system on the ground. I mean, there's Ulivik, which is a health center in Dorval that they've established like a pretty good kind of home base away from home for the Inuit who fly in from Quebec's 14 Inuit communities. So there's definitely a lot of that framework already in place, but unfortunately, it's more money. We need a lot more money, and it needs to be consistent and long term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Faiz, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what Sarah and Chris have been saying is just so important. It's very, very, very hard to stress how important it is to really reinvest invest for the first time in housing. I would say that the way I see it is the way the economy is moving, the way the market is moving, and the way government is moving. There's going to be more inequality. There's going to be more housing insecurity in the city, and the government budgets are going to be very, 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 very stretched in the next 10 years. I know, I've been in the community sector for over 15 years, and I see austerity coming, with the deficits and everything. So the way I'm responding is getting the community organizations here to acquire property with the resources they have now, so that they can stop bleeding and start growing more assets. Because when the government is lean, like Chris was saying earlier, all the programs get cut. So we know what works now. We just need the resources. That's number one, I think. And number two is we really need to take care of each other. I think it's really important. Yes, push
That's
government,
great.
but also let's really remember that we have so much collective power. It's incredible. Like just like I was saying earlier, just when you look at investments in real estate, 95% is private. When you're looking for money, you're scratching, you're fighting the government. All the community organizations are trying to like fight for a very small piece of pie. There's tons of money out there. We need to really be real with people who have resources and say, hey, we're a community, and you know you're doing well for each other, for yourself. You know, why don't you reinvest in your community, because your kids are going to grow up in this world. You know, so anyway.
Exactly. Thank you.
That's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you guys so much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But before we do, I just want to ask, where can we follow you guys? You know, find your work, follow you. Chris. You're first.
Rover.substack.com is my newsletter. You can read all the news stories on Ricochet.media, and I'm on Twitter. It's Tito Curtis, TitoCurtis.
Perfect. Everyone, follow Chris. Faiz, where can we follow you? And Brick by Brick.
Yeah, so Brick by Brick, actually brick par brick in French.com is the website. And on Facebook, we post all the community kind of stuff, the fun stuff that we do. So it's just brick par brick. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Sophie?
Yeah, so Meals for Milton Parc can be followed on basically any social media. It's just Meals for Milton Parc. Parc is with a C. And then we also have a website, which is mealsformiltonpark.org.
Great. And you guys are on Facebook too, right?
Yeah, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of it.
Perfect. Great. Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time. It was such a pleasure hearing from you and learning a little bit more on this topic.
Thank you, Savanna.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Of course. Stay safe,
nice
everyone.
you as well. Yeah, you too.
Thanks for all the work you guys do. It's great.
Great.
Thank you guys. All right, we'll be in touch. Everyone take care. Have a good night, okay? Thank you. Bye.